Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of Congregational Humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. I'm David Breeden, Senior Minister. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm Allison Wyeth, Director of Religious Education, and I have the privilege of serving the youth and families here at First Unitarian Society. Today I have the extra special privilege of sharing a story with you during our time for all ages. So gather around the young ones and anyone who just likes a good story. You know, sometimes it seems like the world is the way it always has been, but we know that's not true. Today's story is about one of the things that has changed not that long ago, but seems so obvious now, it's hard to believe it ever wasn't so. Today's story is about the day women in the United States earned the right to vote. How long ago was that? Only 100 years ago this week. Here's our story. Camilla Can Vote by Mary Morgan Ketchel with Senator Marsha Blackburn. Camilla had been waiting for this day for weeks. Her class was finally on their field trip to the History Museum, and she was so excited. History was her favorite. Votes for Women read the words above the entrance. Class, Miss Travis called to get everyone's attention. Who's heard of the women's suffrage movement? A few students raised their hand. Others shook their heads. Suffrage? Camilla wondered. Sounds a little scary. Miss Travis smiled. Don't worry. The women's suffrage movement refers to an effort by very brave women who did something big. They secured the right to vote. That's what suffrage means. Are you ready to learn more? As the students filed in, a tour guide met them in the lobby. Her name was Wendy. Welcome, everyone. I can't wait to show you our women's suffrage exhibit. You'll learn so much about this part of our history, you'll feel like you traveled back in time. The class filed into a large room full of glass cases with mannequins dressed in old-timey clothes, saw huge black and white photographs and other old items. Wendy explained, in 1848, a group of women met in Seneca Falls, New York, for the first convention in the United States about women's rights. They didn't know it then, but this meeting was the start of the movement to get women the right to vote. It's hard to imagine now, but when they met, women could not vote. Only men voted. That's weird, Camilla thought. A bit later, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met and became lifelong friends. Together, they worked for 50 years fighting for the right to vote. Because of their work, more and more women joined the cause. A woman named Alice Paul organized protests around the country and even in front of the White House, trying to get the president to support their right to vote. Finally, after decades of work, the United States was almost ready to amend the Constitution to ensure that women had the right to vote. But to change the Constitution, they needed one last state, Tennessee, to decide, would they ratify, vote for the amendment, or nullify, vote against the amendment. Pro-suffrage supporters passed out yellow roses to wear, while those against handed out red ones. If Tennessee joined the other states and ratified the amendment, women across the U.S. would have the right to vote. Wendy handed out yellow rose pins to all the students to remind them of the symbol of women's suffrage. When it was Camilla's turn, something amazing happened. Just as it was fastened to her shirt, it was no longer a pin at all. Instead, it was transformed into a real rose. Camilla realized she wasn't in the museum anymore. She looked around and realized that everyone was dressed in old-timey clothes. But they were real people. Everyone was busy handing out roses and campaign signs. Camilla asked, "Excuse me, what day is it?" "It's August 18, 1920. 1920, Camilla gasped. "Today's the day. The final vote for the 19th Amendment." Camilla joined the march toward the state capitol, and as they arrived, they saw a man pushing through the crowd holding a letter in his hand. "That's Representative Harry T. Byrne. He's against the amendment," Camilla heard. The letter he held was from his mother, a suffrage supporter asking him to vote to ratify the amendment. Once inside the Capitol, both sides gave speeches and people packed the gallery to watch. The House clerk began calling roll, and as each man was called, they voted yes or no. When the clerk finally called Harry T. Burns' name, to everyone's surprise, he voted yes. With that vote, the 19th Amendment became law across the U.S. Women now had the right to vote. As Harry T. Byrne left the hall, everyone cheered, especially Camilla. "Inside voice, Camilla," Ms. Travis said. Camilla looked down and touched her rose pin, no longer a real yellow rose. But how? I was just... Camilla took a deep breath. She couldn't believe what had happened that day. It felt so real. She thought to herself, Miss Travis was right. This was an amazing trip. On the ride back to school, Camilla found she couldn't imagine a world where grown women like her mom, Miss Travis, or Wendy didn't have the right to vote. And she was grateful and proud of the women who spent 72 years fighting, petitioning, and educating to have their voices heard. Wasn't that a great story? Of course, we know that the approving of the 19th Amendment didn't immediately allow all women to easily vote. We know that Native American women couldn't vote for at least 4 more years until their U.S. citizenship was recognized, and that Black women and other women of color often faced obstacles to voting put in place by those who didn't want them to be heard. But we also know that celebrating strides in social justice is important, and that each step forward is an inspiration for bringing justice to all. In the coming days, talk to those around you and think of ways you can promote justice and fairness for all.
Allison, thank you for that wonderful story about voting rights. This is a story we need to tell early and often. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday online assembly of First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis for August 16th, 2020. I'm the Reverend Kelli Clement, one of the assistant ministers here at FUS. I'm joined online today by the Reverend Dr. David Breeden, Senior Minister, the Reverend Jim Foti, Assistant Minister, Allison Wyeth, Director of Religious Education, Barb Brooks, Music Director, and a terrific tech team who is making today possible for all of us and all of you. Thank you for making the effort to be present with us today from wherever you are. First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. We are an intentionally and radically inclusive congregational humanist community dedicated to promoting a brave, free, and responsible search for purpose, meaning, and justice. Our theme for August is Season of Change, Summer 2020 at FUS. You know by now that our building is closed and that this congregation is one of the open mind, the open hand, and the open heart. And you know the best way to find out about all the things that are happening at FUS is to carefully read our Friday email and our monthly newsletter. That's where we put all the good information. If you're not already on the email list, you can sign up for it via our homepage on our website, firstunitarian.org. The link is right down at the bottom of the homepage. Another great way to stay connected online is to join our members and friends of First Unitarian Society group on Facebook. There is where a good conversation is happening, and we'd love to have your input there. If you like what you see here today, we would be delighted if you would subscribe to our online content. In the description on the bottom of your screen, you will see how you can support the mission of Congregational Humanism at FUS. After assembly today, we invite you to join our popular coffee hour. We'll be using the breakout rooms feature. It usually lasts about half an hour, and of course you are welcome to come and go as you wish. It's always good to see each other's faces there. Even as other parts of the wider community are opening up, First Unitarian Society will continue to have an online-only Sunday morning presence for many months to come. Thank you so much for joining us today.
This year's State Fair is canceled. That's why we're offering Deep Fried Talent on a Stick, a State Fair themed talent show starring the people of FUS. Have you decided what you're going to perform? So far, we've got a clarinet, a harp, and at least 2 fiddles. We've got poetry, song, and even a dance number. In between performances, you'll see photos of arts and crafts, culinary feats, and agricultural accomplishments. And everybody gets a blue ribbon. Join us for Deep Fried Talent, Saturday, August 29th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. on Zoom. Email Reverend Jim to register and learn more, and we'll see you at the get-together. Each week when we gather, we light our chalice and share one of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, or one of the aspirations of our congregation. This week we light the chalice remembering the 5th principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large.
Now for our congregational covenant. Love is the spirit of this place, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
There will be better days. 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 Let the wave wash over. There will be better days. There will be better days. There will be better days. I am there will be better days. 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 Let the wave wash over. There will be better days. There will be better days. There will be better days. Let the wave wash over. There will be better days. There will be better days. Let the wave wash over. There will be better days. There will be better days. There will be better days. I am there will be better days. There will be better days. There will be better days. Let the wave wash over. There will be better days. There will be better days. There will be better days. Let the wave wash over. There will be better days.
On Sundays when we gather, whether in person or online, we take a few minutes to reflect on the joys, sorrows, and milestones of the human experience. We do this so that we stay in touch with our own humanity. We do this to remind ourselves of the value of a moment of stillness. And we do this so that no one among us is alone, either in celebrating joy or in facing the burdens of life. This morning, we hold in our thoughts FUS members Katrin and Clarence Friday, as they grieve the loss and remember the life of Kat's beloved grandfather, Bruce Snyder. Bruce died late last month in Harlingen, Texas, where he had lived since the 1960s. He was 89 years old and had a long, good life full of service to others and laughter-filled relationships. Bruce worked for decades as a science teacher and entomologist, and he loved nothing more than good company and getting others to smile. Kat says she could never have imagined a scenario in which she couldn't be there with her family to say goodbye in person. Technology is better than nothing during sad times, but it's not quite the same for one's heart. We know that Kat and her family gratefully take up the task of being bearers of Bruce's story, carriers of his memory, and living examples of how he moved through the world with love. We offer our support, condolences, and companionship during this time of grief and remembrance. We now take a moment of silence to reflect on all the challenges and heartbreak going on in our lives and in our world. And we think with gratitude of those who are building a more just, compassionate, and peaceful world. As we come out of the silence, we'll hear our traditional musical response. You're invited to sing along at home if you wish.
And we believe in life and in the strength of love, and we have found our need to be together. We have our hearts to give, we have our thoughts to receive, and we believe that sharing is an answer.
This is an excerpt from a piece by Margaret Talbot in the August 3rd issue of the New Yorker magazine. For a country that prides itself on democracy, the United States has forced a lot of its citizens to fight for the privilege of voting. August 18th marks the centenary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which declares that the vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That milestone is sometimes described as having given women the right to vote. It wasn't a gift. It was a hard-won victory on the part of the suffragists, who'd been agitating for it for more than 70 years on the basis of their common humanity with man. Even in the decade before the amendment was passed, its ratification was by no means a certainty. Though women had the vote in a handful of Western states, elsewhere in the country, state after state turned down women's suffrage. The antis, who fretted that women would be irredeemably sullied by the rough and tumble of politics and would push issues such as temperance and wage equality, included women as well as men. It took a surge of inventive, audacious, confrontational protests, inspired in part by militant British suffragists, to re-energize the movement. In January 1917, the National Women's Party, led by the single-minded young suffragist Alice Paul, began a campaign of civil disobedience. For the first time, protesters picketed the White House. Woodrow Wilson, a Southern Democrat and patrician racist who had been re-elected president the previous year, had no interest in supporting a federal amendment granting women the right to vote, but tolerated the provocation for a while. After the United States entered the First World War, though, the suffragists started carrying signs comparing Wilson to the Kaiser, and his patience ran out. In June, the police began arresting the protesters en masse. Convicted of offenses such as disorderly conduct and obstructing sidewalk traffic, they were imprisoned in harsh and filthy conditions in the Occoquan workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. When the women were denied recognition as political prisoners, they went on hunger strike, and the guards subjected them to horrific force feedings. The more moderate suffragists continued to lobby male politicians, for the most part politely and effectively. But when Congress passed the 19th Amendment and the states ratified it, that victory was largely due to the new breed of suffragists who simply would not stand down. The disenfranchisement of Black women was a cause that Alice Paul and the newly formed League of Women Voters should have taken up, not least because African Americans had been key figures in the drive for female suffrage, dating back to Frederick Douglass's enthusiastic participation in the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech 3 years later, right up through the NAACP's advocacy for the cause starting in the 1910s. Yet when Black women's groups appealed to Paul for help in 1921, she refused them, saying that the problem was a race issue and not a woman's issue. In a powerful speech on the House floor last week, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez denounced the language she had been subjected to by a colleague, Ted Yoho. He had called her, among other things, disgusting and out of your freaking mind. In some ways, the kind of verbal abuse she cited isn't so different from the denigration heaped on women who protested for the vote. In 1918, the New York Times editorialized that women being jailed for suffrage obsession ought more properly be put in the hands of psychiatrists. How grateful we are to those women and their obsession now. At the recent funeral service for civil rights leader John Lewis, former President Barack Obama said this: "America was built by people like him. America was built by the John Lewises. He, as much as anyone in our history, brought this country a little closer to our highest ideals. And someday, when we do finish that long journey toward freedom, when we do form a more perfect union, whether it's years from now or decades, or even if it takes another 2 centuries, John Lewis will be a founding father of that fuller, fairer, better America." I'm thinking today of the founding mothers, the women who put their bodies on the line for full citizenship, for that fairer, better America. I'm thinking of the iron-jawed angels, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, of writer and activist Ida B. Wells Barnett, and organizer Mary Church Terrell, of Unitarian Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and of Fannie Lou Hamer, who worked for full citizenship in Mississippi in the 1960s. If you know anything about the suffrage movement, you have likely heard of Alice Paul, the single-minded young woman from New Jersey, raised in the tradition of Quaker activism, who brought a passion for women's suffrage and the tactics of civil disobedience home to the U.S., following her time in England, where she was active in the British suffrage movement. And by the way, we say suffragist rather than suffragette. The jet was a pejorative term, and the suffragists later claimed it sort of lightly as their own, but we say suffragist today. It was Paul, along with Lucy Burns and many other women, who marched in parades, picketed Woodrow Wilson's White House, and were jailed and force-fed in defiance of their hunger strikes, all creating press reports that showed to the nation the brutality by which the status quo would be protected. Here at First Unitarian Society, we are rightly proud of the women of this congregation who were actively involved in the movement to get Minnesota to ratify the 19th Amendment. Clara Hampson Euland, Alice Ames Winter, and others. You may also know that it took 72 years from the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton presented the Declaration on the Rights and Sentiments of Women, calling for the right of women to vote. 72 years from that convention to the passage of the 19th. Only one woman, Charlotte Woodward Pierce, was both present at Seneca Falls and lived to see the passage of the 19th. But unfortunately, her ill health kept her from exercising her right to vote before she died. I try to remember that 72-year span when I think the wheels of justice move too slowly. And then I remember that actually it took 117 years, 117 years for all the people in this democracy to achieve the vote via the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here is what Carol Anderson of the Jackson, Mississippi League of Women Voters wrote earlier this year. After the 1869 meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and even Frederick Douglass deemed Black women's claims for voting freedom less urgent than those of white women and Black men, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper asserted, "We are all bound up in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse of its own soul. She demanded Black women be included as part of one great privileged nation. Anderson continues, the 19th Amendment indeed finally gave women the right to vote, but we well understand, especially here in Mississippi, that Black women and men continued to battle for their legal privilege to cast ballots. A portion of that ultimate victory, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, is also owed to Black lionesses like Ella Baker, Daisy Bates, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dorothy Height, Diane Nash, Septima Poinsett Clark, Rosa Parks, and others. Much of this history comes to life in the new book, Vanguard, by historian and legal scholar Martha Jones. She offers a new history of African American women's political lives in America, recounting how they defied both racism and sexism to fight for the ballot, and how they wielded political power to secure equality and dignity of all persons. These original feminists and anti-racists were women who from the earliest days of the Republic were at the vanguard of women's rights, calling America to realize its best ideals. And the fight goes on. You may know that the heart of the 1965 Voting Rights Act was gutted by the 2013 Supreme Court decision. And since that time, marginalized communities, including Native Americans, African Americans, Latinx Americans, Asian Americans, and others in various states, have had to overcome obstacles that most white voters do not. One of the most important ways we can help secure the franchise for all people is to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act into law. The Lewis Act creates a new formula that applies to all states and hinges on rooting out repeated voter suppression over a rolling 25-year period. If the work of democracy is never done, this is the next part of our work to do, to pass this law to ensure voting rights for all Americans. Our democracy is under grave threat from many sides, from authoritarianism, from money in politics, and especially from the efforts to suppress the vote. Currently, the existential threat to the United States Postal Service by the current administration constitutes the direst menace to voting rights. Some of us are also rightly worried about the coming wave of evictions and how this might affect people who may be newly homeless and affect their ability to vote. The good news here, if we can find good news, is that in all 50 states, one does not need a physical address to cast a ballot. The National Coalition of the Homeless has the You Don't Need a Home to Vote campaign to educate people experiencing housing insecurity about their voting rights. What must be considered, of course, is that while voting is a basic function of citizenship, people who are enduring the trauma of living without secure housing may not have the immediate capacity to exercise their right to vote. Another area of voter rights that needs our attention is the return of the franchise to felons who have completed their sentences. A consequence of mass incarceration, and this is no accident, is that over 6 million Americans, including 1 in 13 African Americans, cannot vote because of a felony conviction. This is not right. As Unitarian Universalists, we think the democratic process is so important that we include it in the 7 principles by which we are guided. We covenant to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. This is not just political for us. It is bedrock to who we are as humanists and as human beings, that because each person has worth and dignity, that each of us has the right to make our voices heard. When Alice Paul was imprisoned and on hunger strike, she was taken to the psychiatric ward. The male doctor there asked Paul to explain her cause to him. As played by Hilary Swank in the film Iron-Jawed Angels, she hesitates and then says, "Look into your own heart. I swear to you, mine is no different. You want a place in the trades and professions where you can earn your bread? So do I. You want some means of self-expression, some way of satisfying your own personal ambitions. So do I. You want a voice in the government under which you live? So do I. What is there to explain?" The story of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution 100 years ago this week is a wonderful and complicated tale of tenacity, of young activists who have a different idea from the old guard of how to make change, of the kind of conviction that risks lives and health for greater good, of a single-minded focus on one issue that left out those who are most marginalized, of partial success masquerading as the whole thing, of rights enshrined but not ensured. As we continue to protect and defend this fragile democracy, let us do so in such a way that no one is ever left out again.
Join me from home in our Extinguishing the Chalice words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. All of these we carry in our hearts and in our minds until we are together again.
Florence Price, the first noted African-American female composer to gain national status, was born in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1887. Price won the first prize in the Wanamaker competition with her symphony in E minor, and as a result became the first female composer of African descent to have a symphonic work performed by a major national symphony orchestra. She also wrote a lot of piano music, and I think she had piano methods that had different levels. This one is called Ticklin' Toes, and it's a 3.5 level. And when I was YouTubing this, all I could see were children playing this, so I hope I can do it justice. It's called Ticklin' Toes.
Thanks for joining us during the season of change, the summer of 2020. And we need you to help keep the voice of Unitarian Universalist humanism alive and strong. We have a message of hope and freedom, and we want to share it with the world. You can give on the Give Plus app. You can also give on PayPal, and you can go to our website, firstunitarian.org. Also, we have lots of volunteer opportunities around First Unitarian Society. And if you would like to volunteer or share what your passion is, email me, minister@firstunitarian.org. Thank you so much. Until we meet again, be fearless, ask questions, hold on to what is good, strengthen the weak, comfort the fearful, serve the suffering, do what makes you come alive. Because in this season of change, we need lots of people who come alive. Rejoice in the power of the human spirit. So may it be. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.